Hello, everyone. My name is Christina Limo, and none of you have really met me before. I am, I believe, the only Canadian student in the class, and I'm joining you for this last semester. Hi, and nice to meet you. So, I'm joining Father Kyle Behrens and Father Peter Fonseca in a group, and we're group one, and I am group member A, and we've chosen to analyze the Mexico City policy, which is an American federal policy to do with funding for non-governmental organizations engaged in foreign aid work. And so specifically to that policy, we're going to be focusing on President Trump's January 23rd, 2017 memorandum, which expanded on the original Mexico City policy, which was first instituted by Ronald Reagan and his administration at the Second International Conference on Population, which I will get to later. So this conference was held in Mexico City, which is where the policy derives its name, and this took place from the 6th to the 14th of August in 1984. And the current administration has actually renamed it to be called Protecting Life in Global Health Assistance. So a bit more of a focused and descriptive title. So I'm going to go first through a general description of the public policy into kind of the history and rationale of the policy and end up with what our group has discerned are the relevant bioethical principles and how they kind of apply to this case very briefly, since I know my two colleagues will be expanding more on those ideas. So after the January 23rd, 2017 reinstatement of the Mexico City policy, an implementation plan was announced on May 15th of the same year, so that's 2017. And in the past, when in effect, the policy required non-governmental organizations, I'll probably be referring to them as NGOs, to certify that they would not, quote, perform or actively promote abortion as a method of family planning, end quote. And that includes using funds from any source, including non-US funds. So this is a condition for receiving US government global family planning assistance. So it has expanded to include prohibiting organizations from accessing these funds if they also fund not only coercive abortion practices and counseling, but also involuntary sterilization. So this is a big deal. President Trump's administration has expanded the policy. So this includes, like I said, I'll be restating a couple of things. This includes both foreign NGOs receiving US funding directly as prime recipients or indirectly as subrecipients. So I should make a note here to say that all of my quotes and references and all these statistics that I will be coming up with can be found on my resource page, which will be attached to this post. So everything is there if you want to look further into this. So under the Trump administration, the policy scope has, as I just said, been significantly expanded. So it now includes most other US bilateral global health assistance. And this new expansion obviously targets a lot of NGOs who are doing various work, but has expanded its list of aid to include organizations that tackle issues such as maternal and child health, including household level water sanitation and hygiene, nutrition, HIV, tuberculosis, malaria, neglected tropical diseases, and global health security. So it's expanded quite a bit to include a lot of other things, which is a really good thing because, you know, a lot of people in these countries obviously have a lot of needs related to family planning that have to do with more than just the actual procreation of children, but to do with general health and sanitation around that. So the vast majority of bilateral global health funding is appropriate is appropriated directly to 3 agencies and departments. And these 3 agencies and departments are 1, USAID, 2, the Department of State, including the Office of the Global AIDS Coordinator. And this office oversees and coordinates U.S. global HIV funding under the U.S. President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. And the 3rd department, and this is for the first time, the Department of Defense. So these are the 3 agencies and departments where funding is appropriated. And there now exists 3 types of funding agreements where previously there were 2. So the previous 2, which are included once again, are grants and cooperative agreements. And now added as a 3rd method are contracts. So as a kind of illustration of how many NGOs are affected by the new terms of this policy, I'm going to throw out some numbers here, which obviously you don't have to remember because you can check them out in the resource page. So most affected foreign NGOs, which are about 92%, are organizations which have historically received most of the funding, and this is 1.2 billion out of 1.36 billion, which is about 88%, so this is a big number. They would not have been subject to the policy under its pre-expansion terms. So this is significant. This is like 80th percentile inclusion of organizations who are effective. That's huge. I mean, that's much more than half, obviously. So a lot of organizations are going to be affected, and this is, of course, a good thing, which again my colleagues will most likely expand upon. So the history and rationale for the policy, I kind of touched on it before. So it's named for Mexico City because that was the venue where the United Nations International Conference on Population and Development was taking place, and where this policy was first announced by U.S. President Ronald Reagan's administration, and this was in 1984. So this policy remained intact through Bush Sr.'s administration as president, but once President Bill Clinton came to power, the policy was rescinded, and this was in 1993. So most recently, it has been reinstated after President Clinton by President George W. Bush, and then it was rescinded once again by President Obama in 2009, and obviously most recently it's been reinstated and expanded by President Trump in 2017. So just looking at those names, and obviously these names are more coherent to my fellow classmates as Americans, it's very obviously delineated. The reinstatement and rescinding policy of the administrations is delineated very much by party lines, with Democrats rescinding the policy and Republicans instating and reinstating the policy. So this is very obvious. For a more detailed kind of visual of the back and forth nature of this between Republican and Democratic government administration, there's actually a visual table in the Kaiser Family Foundation website reference, which again can be found in my resources. So if you want to take a look at that, it's kind of a nice visual of how it's really split between party lines. Now, each of these presidential administrations kind of instituted and reinstated the policy through presidential memoranda. It is possible that Congress institute the policy through legislation, but historically that's only happened once, and very briefly under the Clinton administration. And the reason that this was not necessarily to do so much with the contents of the policy, but because it was a part of a broader arrangement and legislation to do with that, to pay the U.S. debt back to the UN. So the legislation that was passed for the Mexico City policy didn't really have to do with enshrining any of its kind of key points or objectives, but more to do tangentially with U.S. debt payment to the UN. So the rationale behind the Mexico City policy and its subsequent presidential memoranda is again really delineated by party line, Democrat versus Republican, and the language of the original document, which was drafted under a Republican administration, really illustrates the sense of what is motivating this policy, and that is the fact that abortion as a method of family planning is inconsistent with the values which many Americans hold, and therefore it's not worthy of being funded. And then obviously conversely, the Democratic administrations and the language of the rescinding of the original policy make note of two things mostly. A, the broad nature of the policy, and B, its unwarranted nature. So the broad nature being that certain things such as abortion or abortion counseling are a no-no, no matter what, whether a woman has been raped or her life is threatened or whatever her circumstances. So that being one of the criticisms. But not only that, but that the broad nature is simply unwarranted, that to completely slash funding from these methods of what I suppose Democratic administrations would consider legitimate forms of family planning is just obviously inconceivable to that administration. And this is best illustrated by a quote from President Obama's memorandum, in which he stated that the original and subsequently reinstated policies, quote, have undermined efforts to promote safe and effective voluntary family planning programs, end quote. Obviously those programs are not safe for preborn children or really even safe for women and their families, but obviously that's to be determined by my colleagues. So now I just want to close with mentioning the relevant bioethical principles and how they apply to our case study of the Mexico City policy, and specifically President Trump's memorandum. So I'd like to begin by saying that there are obviously two groups of actors who we've identified as a group, and so each of these two groups have moral culpability and are obviously making decisions of a moral and ethical nature. And so the first group of actors would be the American people, the taxpayer, who are represented by their democratically elected government. And the second group of actors would naturally be the non-governmental organizations and their staff who are receiving the funding. So these are the two groups. Now, the first relevant principle to this policy is an obvious one. It's the principle of the right to life, and it is relevant in so much as it directly deals with family planning, quote, family planning in relation to abortion, as having abortion as a method of family planning. So secondarily to that, though, under the principle of the right to life, it obviously engages in principles of integrity and totality, because things like sterilization, whether involuntary or voluntary, and methods of birth control, hormonal birth control predicated on devices like the IUD, and even condom use, obviously violates principles of integrity and totality, and so these principles are touched upon as well in this policy issue. The second really broad bioethical principle which affects this policy is cooperation in evil. And this is particularly important when looking at the policy as a policy which allocates taxpayer funds. So these are not just funds that belong to the government, but funds which the average American is actively contributing to. So by its nature, the taxpayer is cooperating in these actions. And now, whether this is remote, material, proximate, etc., my colleagues will be exploring in their presentation. So cooperation in evil affects our first actor, that is the democratically elected government who are representing the American people, but it also does affect the NGOs and their staff members, because obviously they are cooperating in evil as well when they are performing or counseling people for these procedures, whether it's sterilization, abortion, contraceptive counseling, etc. And having worked for a not-for-profit and non-governmental organization myself, I know that sometimes staff members may not necessarily agree with all of the tenets of the organization, and so there is a level of cooperation in evil for that. For example, an individual who works for an NGO who provides prenatal counseling and postnatal care, but does not agree with their organization's counseling on abortion, although they themselves do not engage in that. So that's cooperation in evil. And the third principle which affects our topic is the principle of subsidiarity. And that actually applies most directly to our first group of actors, and that is the American people and their government, because this being a mandate enacted by a presidential memorandum is significant, and my colleagues will be discussing this more in depth, but the fact that this has not been enshrined in law by Congress is a big deal. Should the president be signing a policy memorandum that Congress should and could take care of? So that's another issue. So those are our three relevant bioethical principles, and I'll say them again. The principle of the right to life, and kind of a sub-principle to that would be the principle of integrity and totality. The second principle being cooperation in evil, and the third principle being the principle of subsidiarity, and remembering that there are two actors. So that is my presentation for you. I welcome your questions and I look forward to receiving them, and it was very nice to indirectly meet all of you. Thanks.